Here we go, continuing our tour of the macromolecules. This is the fourth and final class of macromolecules, lipids. So lipids come in basically three varieties. We have triglycerides, tri meaning three, and you can probably see here why tri is involved in the name. Phospholipids here in the middle, and a large family called cholesterol. Here's one example of a cholesterol. So in each of these three pictures, we have not only the chemical formula, which, by the way, do not even think about memorizing. It's not terribly important. We have the chemical layout, but we also have the three-dimensional shape of the molecule. So this is what it would actually look like. Here's how we would draw it out on a piece of paper using the chemical symbols and elements. So starting off with triglycerides. So triglycerides really have two parts. They have a glycerol head, which you see here, and then three, again there's the tri part, three what we call fatty acid chains, fatty acid tails that link to the glycerol. Hopefully you guys are recognizing this right here, that HOH is going to leave, and it's going to bond this carbon, a carbonyl carbon, with the oxygen of the glycerol head. That leaves an ester bond, and we call that, hopefully it's getting familiar to you, a dehydration synthesis. So water's coming out as we link these fatty acid tails to the glycerol head. In general, this happens in the liver. The liver is where you make your triglycerides. You guys remember from a couple days ago when we did our diabetes unit, we talked about the liver pulling excess glucose, that's like our energy molecule, out of our bloodstream and linking them together into the polysaccharide glycogen. Well, you can only have so much glycogen before you have too much short-term energy storage in the glycogen, and at that point, your liver starts to convert the glycogen to triglycerides. And the triglycerides are stored in fat cells around your body as your long-term energy storage. Our next class of lipids are the phospholipids. So phospholipids are very similar to triglycerides. Here you see that same glycerol head, three carbons, hydrogens. The difference is, and here's a couple fatty acid tails, the difference is there's only two fatty acid tails. So triglycerides had three, phospholipids only have two fatty acid tails. In place of the third one is a phosphate group that we call the phosphate head. So it's like we've got two tails and a head, a phosphate head, on these phospholipids. Phospholipids also form through a dehydration synthesis. This is the fourth macromolecule we talked about, forming through dehydration synthesis. So hopefully that part is catching up with you. They're generally made in every single cell. They're very, very important to cells. They are the primary component in the cell membrane, which is the unit we'll start next. So a quick aside here before we get on to cholesterol. You've seen now fatty acid tails in both triglycerides and in phospholipids. So a little bit about those fatty acid tails. They're generally very similar, all tails. They are hydrocarbon tails. So they're carbon, hydrogen, carbon, hydrogen, carbon, hydrogen. These long chains of carbon and hydrogen that you see here. On the top, there tend to be a carboxyl head, which is a C double bonded to an O, and an OH, and that's how they're able to link to the glycerol, is with that OH right there. Most fatty acid tails have between 16 or 18 carbons in them. And then one big difference, you see it circled out here and here, is that sometimes you have a double bonded carbon to carbon. That double bonded carbon to carbon means that these carbons can make one less bond to hydrogen. So you notice how most carbons are bonded to two hydrogens. The one on the end here is even bonded to three. Most of these guys are bonded to two hydrogens. And then you get to the double bond. the double bond, because the carbon is sharing a second bond with carbon, he can only make one bond to hydrogen. In Greek, the word saturated means full. So a saturated fatty acid, like the one you see on top here, is full of hydrogens. It has the maximum number of hydrogens, no carbon-carbon double bonds. Whereas down below, these bottom two examples, they each have at least one double bond, which means they do not have the maximum number of hydrogen. They are not full of hydrogen. And so these are called unsaturated fatty acids. You're going to read a little bit more about those in your homework this evening. Finally then, we have cholesterol. Cholesterol is a whole family of lipids. Generally, they all look very similar. Without the untrained eye, all of these structures down here would look really similar. In fact, I'm looking at them and they look incredibly similar to me. They're all types of cholesterols, very similar molecule, and you'll notice that they have this ring structure, so they don't have that fatty acid tail that the phospholipids and triglycerides had. Instead, they have these ring structures, which make them kind of look like carbohydrates, except they don't have that 1 carbon to 2 hydrogen to 1 oxygen ratio that we find in carbohydrates. Less total oxygens, more total hydrogens in these cholesterols. So there's a lot of different cholesterols, and they serve a lot of different purposes. One of their main purposes, they serve as hormones, which are chemical messengers. They go around and communicate amongst your cells. Estrogen and testosterone, here's a picture of testosterone here, those are pretty well-known hormones that are involved in growth. Cholesterols are also really, really important in the cell membrane. And again, we'll talk about that in the next unit. So those are your 3 types of lipids. And we have now discussed all 4 classes of macromolecules. So make sure you're aware of all 4 of them. There's carbohydrates. We started with those. The monomer is the monosaccharide. There are proteins. We touched on them second. The monomer is the amino acid. There are nucleic acids. It's DNA and RNA. The NA stands for nucleic acids. The monomer there is nucleotide. And then today we talked about the lipid category, lipid class of macromolecules. No real monomer for the lipids. All macromolecules are formed through dehydration synthesis. You guys saw that a lot this unit, so make sure you keep that in mind. And then finally, all 4 of those different macromolecules have different functions. So make sure you guys are familiar with what the function of each of these macromolecules is.